Hey guys, what's up? We're going to take a look at Chapter 31 of the American Pageant, taking a look at the 1920s and some of the main things that occurred during the 1920s. So, one of the big things that happened at the beginning of the 1920s came as a result of the communist revolution that took place in Russia in 1917. So, one of the things that we've been talking about a lot up to this point is how a lot of the unions in this country resembled a lot of the things that Karl Marx was discussing in the Communist Manifesto, right? The idea of all the workers coming together around the world, right? So workers of the world unite. And so when the Communist Revolution happens in the Soviet Union, and what becomes the Soviet Union, the U.S. government and U.S. businesses got together, right, already together, and they begin to basically look at what was happening in the United States, and they began to fear that if what happened in the Soviet Union happened there, right, it could possibly happen in the United States because, again, it was the Russian workers and farmers and stuff coming together, very similar to what was happening in the United States in terms of populism and the labor unions, especially with the industrial workers of the world led by Eugene Debs, right, that, of course, they were nicknamed the Wobblies. And so in 1917, when the Espionage Act was passed, the federal government began trying to use the Espionage Act after World War One to try to begin to go after some of these radicals, right? A lot of that was also stemming from the fact that Americans at the end of World War One turned to isolationism. So a lot of Americans at the end of the war were like, we shouldn't have been involved in this war. There was also an increased amount of nativism, right, towards immigrants. A lot of Americans felt like we were in World War One because of these immigrants and because of these European immigrants specifically. And so again, a lot of Americans began to look at things like socialism and any other type of European ideals as being sort of radical or un-American, and so they began to despise these things. So, as a result, in 1919, 1920, we had what was called the American Red Scare. Red being the color of the communists. The Attorney General under Woodrow Wilson was a guy by the name of A. Mitchell Palmer, and so it became his job to go after anybody who was suspected of being a threat to the U.S. government. And so between 1919 and 1920, over 6,000 people who were suspected of being communists were arrested. A lot of the things that we began to see was a lot of states began to cut back on things like free speech as a result, because again, anybody that was seen as being anything related to communism was suspected. And so this is going to play a major role in some of the things that happens at the beginning of the 1920s. There was a case that took place called the Sacco and Vanzetti case. We'll talk a little bit about it more in class tomorrow when we go over it. But 1921, these two men, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, they were convicted of murder. They were Italian immigrants, they were atheists, anarchists, and draft dodgers. And so even though some of the evidence, and again, we'll take a look a little bit more at the detail tomorrow in class, even though some of the evidence points to the fact that they probably were guilty, at the time, a lot of people felt like the reason they were being prosecuted, what made it easier was the fact that they, because of the increased nativism that was happening in the United States, eventually both men were executed for murder. Another growing concern at the time was the KKK. The KKK came back during this time period. Again, they became really popular, especially amongst white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. By 1924, 1/6 of all males in the United States was a registered member of the KKK. They were anti-foreign, anti-Catholic, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-pacifist, anti-communist, anti-internationalist, anti-revolutionary, anti-bootlegging, anti-gambling, anti-adultery, anti-birth control. So again, just very anti anything that they felt was not right. As you can see in this picture, right, a major march taking place in Washington, D.C. And again, this is all part of the growing sort of backlash that began to happen in the 1920s. The 1920s are a very interesting decade because you get sort of this birth of modern America while traditional America is trying to hold back on what it had. So again, anti-foreignism, 1920 to 1921 saw 800,000 European sorry, it took like a pause right there, so I don't know if it was right here, so I'm just going to start from right here. So 1920, 1921, we saw about 800,000 new European immigrants come in. As a result of the increased nativism that was happening in our country, the federal government reacted to it, and they actually passed what was called the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. And basically what it did was it said that the United States government was only going to allow 3% of the population of a certain group of people in 1910 to come in. So let's say, for example, that the population of Croatians in 1910 was 100, that the United States government was only going to allow from now on 3 Croatians to come in. So again, that would be 3% of the 100, right? So again, they were trying to limit the amount of immigrants that were coming in. Now, 3 years later, because the federal government realized, and a lot of the American people that were putting pressure on the government realized that that was still a large number, the government even went further with the act when they passed the Immigration Act of 1924. And so what they did was they actually lowered it to 2% of the population of 1890. So again, if the population was 10 in 1890, right, then again, taking a look at 2%, right, so they wouldn't have allowed anybody in at the time. So Prohibition, right? The 18th Amendment was passed following World War I. Again, complete prohibition. One of the things that was also added to the 18th Amendment was something called the Volstead Act. And what the Volstead Act did was it actually gave the federal government money to provide so that the Treasury Department could go after people that were breaking the law. So prohibition of alcohol, it was supported by women. It was very, very popular in the Midwest and the South. A lot of it had to do with the increased amount of fundamentalism. And again, one of the major groups that played a big role in this was the women's Christian temperance movement. Now, there was a lot of side effects, though, right? One of the big ones was, of course, gangsterism, right? And I misspelled gangsterism, as you can see. Prohibition led to the rise of gang competition. So one of the things that happened was a lot like drugs today, right? And some of the drug dealing that occurs, is that it led to these mobs beginning to compete against one another, right? Chicago became the hub of this gangsterism. Scarface, Al Capone, as you can see in this picture here, right? They began to focus on things like prostitution and gambling and narcotics. By 1930, the gangs were raking in between 12 to 18 billion dollars. We'll talk a little bit more in class about some of the details regarding this. And then one of the things that we'll also discuss too is the 1932 Lindbergh baby kidnapping. One of the things that also happened that challenged a lot of the stuff that was going on was the Scopes monkey trial, right? So John Dewey had pushed for school reforms, things like science. What that meant was that evolution and creationism were coming to a clash in a lot of schools. And so the 1920s saw a big clash between fundamentalism and liberalism in the 1920s. This came to a head in a place called Dayton, Tennessee. The state of Tennessee actually had a law called the Butler Act, and the Butler Act basically said that you could not teach evolution in public schools. So there was an organization called the American Civil Liberties Union. And one of their main lawyers was a guy named by the name of Clarence Darrow. He was a great defense attorney in the United States. They proposed an idea to try to see what would happen if someone broke the Butler Act. And so there was an opportunity. And so they got this guy, substitute teacher, John Scopes, to actually teach evolution in a science class in Dayton, Tennessee. And so he got in trouble for it. So he went to court. And so William Jennings Bryan, of course, the Cowardly Lion, he is going to he's going to become the prosecuting one because he was a strong fundamentalist. He hated evolution. And so they went up against each other in the heat of the summer in Dayton, Tennessee. And at the end, Scopes was found guilty and he was forced to pay $100 in fines. 5 days after the trial, from the heat and just exhaustion and age, William Jennings Bryan actually dies. Now, the importance of this case, of course, besides the fact that it's just an important case, is the fact that, again, it brings up this issue of creationism versus evolution and whether or not it should be taught in public schools. So we'll discuss this a little bit in class tomorrow. Another major thing with the 1920s, right, is consumerism. We're going to see an increase in consumerism. There was the 1920s brought a little bit of prosperity. One of the things that was evidence of this is Henry Ford's Model T, right, and it's brought this new freedom. Modern advertising, they began to use things like persuasion and sex, and you see here with the Listerine ad. Also, the birth of the installment plan and buying on credit. We'll talk a little bit about this in class tomorrow, too. The automobile changes everything dramatically, right? That's a picture of a Model T. By 1929, 26 million cars were registered. It created 6 million new jobs, new roads, boom of the gas industry, right? Some of the less attractive states began to lose population. The birth of motels, right? Amusement things, people going to sports. The airplane also, right? December 17, 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright, they flew the Kitty Hawk in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. We saw the impact of World War I on the plane. The first transcontinental airmail was done between New York and San Francisco in 1920. And then this is Charles Lindbergh, right? He was the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean in the spirit of St. Louis in 1927. So we begin to see the popularization of the airplane. The radio in the 1890s, Guglielmo Marconi was the first to create the wireless telegraphy. November 1920, the first voice-carrying radio station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, broadcast the Win by Warren G. Harding. Sports are going to blow up as a result of this. People like Babe Ruth, Jack Dempsey, they're going to play a major role. Advertising is going to take advantage of this, right? Taking a look at things like soap operas. And obviously music also. Hollywood, Thomas Edison invented the moving pictures, right? The first, big one being the Great Train Robbery. The first full-length feature, though, was D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. I told you guys about Woodrow Wilson in that one. The first talkie, right? First movie with sound was called The Jazz Singer. Very controversial, right? Because it was blackface. And, of course, the explosion of Hollywoodland, right? Which was later becomes Hollywood. More Americans during this time were living in urban areas for the first time, which is pretty interesting. This is also a picture of Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger became a very controversial figure during this time period, specifically for women, because she began advocating that women should look into more birth control. Became very, very controversial. One of the things we'll talk a little bit about, too, is expanding on the idea of eugenics with her. We saw the explosion of the National Women's Party in 1923. They began advocating for what was called the Equal Rights Amendment, that women should be completely treated as equals. Fundamentalists were also beginning to lose some ground. More and more people began thinking that God was a good God and not necessarily a punishing God, which was challenging some of the status quo. There was also a new breed of young woman. A lot of that came probably from the 19th Amendment. We saw the development of the flapper, shorter dresses, right, tighter, cut the hair, smoking, drinking. They dance more provocatively. They enjoyed jazz music, right, which was called the devil's music. And again, that comes with the coming of the African American. The Harlem Renaissance, right, World War I and the Great Migration saw lots of African Americans move into northern cities. We began to see what was called the New Negro Cultural Movement. Intellectuals, writers, musicians, and so there was this explosion of black culture. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about it in class. So there was also the lost generation. Some of the writers didn't like necessarily what was happening with all of the materialism of the 1920s. People like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, and William Faulkner, they all began to sort of criticize some of the materialism of the 1920s. And then one of the last things, right, is over-speculation. 1920 saw an explosion in this get-rich-quick attitude. The availability of stock, the fragile availability of credit, and then, of course, the crash in October of 1929. But again, we'll take a look at that closer in class.